Blessed be your name in a land that is plentiful, where streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place. Though I walk through the wilderness, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name on a road marked with suffering, though there's pain in the offering. Blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name.
So last week we began this little mini series, just a couple of parts, called The Family Adventure. And we said last week if you go on an adventure, you have to make sure that you have the right source of direction so that you don't get lost. Pretty obvious. And so we said a fairly obvious thing about our families. God, not fill in the blank. And every family probably has a different blank, and that blank changes over time. But God, not fill in the blank, should be the guiding force for my family. Again, pretty obvious stuff. But one of the interesting things that happens when you go on an adventure is that inevitably at some point, if you do enough adventurous things, someone is going to get injured, right? Someone's going to have a wound, someone's going to fall, someone's going to get stitches, someone's going to break something. Like it's bound to happen. I don't believe in jinxes, but I'm scared to even say this. I don't want to jinx myself. Somehow in a lot of our travels, nobody's gotten hurt. And so if it happens this summer, we'll trace it back to this moment. But you try to prepare and have a little first aid kit or something like that. So the closest that this has happened to our family, we were camping over a year ago, and we always have s'mores when we're camping, right? And so camping's sort of an adventurous thing to do, even if you're staying in a camper, if you're in the wilderness. So we were doing s'mores, and Charlotte, bless her heart, she didn't get Hershey's chocolate bars. I don't know if we were trying to save some money, and so she went kind of cheap, and she went Great Value brand. Yeah. Now, Great Value's okay sometimes, but not with chocolate. We didn't know. We assumed it would be okay, right? So we do the chocolate bars. We eat our s'mores. They taste a little different. No big deal. And after we're done eating these s'mores, Gabby notices, and I've asked permission to tell the story, Gabby notices that her lips are swelling, and her tongue is swelling, and she has a little hazelnut allergy. Now, we've just had s'mores. Nothing to worry about, right? So we get out the wrappers, and Great Value has decided that chocolate bars need hazelnut. So it has hazelnut in it, and usually Benadryl. And we've had just a few small reactions to this sort of thing. Benadryl does the job. Benadryl did not do the job. We are camping. We have no cell service. And so about 10:30 at night, probably one of the fastest I've driven before, me and Gabby take off to the emergency room because we also forgot the EpiPen. Because we've never needed the EpiPen before. Why do we need it this time? Well, sure enough, we needed it, so we had to adventure pretty quickly to the emergency room. We've had some ER visits over the years. I think this was the quickest where you go up to the window and you're like, hey, we got this going on. And they looked at her and they took us back immediately. You know the ER, you wait for a long... Immediately, we're back in the back, and they gave her the EpiPen that we could have done at the campsite. Nonetheless, that's the best little, wound or adventure story where somebody got a little bit hurt or had an allergic reaction. I bet we could go around the room, and I bet there's some stories in here of a time when you went on an adventure with your family and someone either came home with a pretty good bruise or stitches or a cast, and maybe even in second class you'll get to tell some of those stories, but it's inevitable that wounds will happen. The same is true in the adventure of life, isn't it? In the adventure of life, wounds are inevitable. Now, here's the thing about the wounds that life gives us. When we deal with some sort of wound in our life, or difficulty or challenge, there's lots of words we could use here besides wound, but we're going to run with the wound word here. When life hands us a wound, there are lots of different ways that we can deal with that, right? So sometimes we handle our difficulties, our challenges, the wounds from our past in positive ways. And that is good, but sometimes we don't handle them so well, and we turn out bitter and angry and jealous and all the stuff that might happen. Now, here's the problem when we don't handle our wounds well. These wounds will impact my family. Isn't that true? All of us have some experience with this at some level, that the wounds we experience in life will impact our family. And so if I don't handle my wounds very well, it's going to have a negative impact on my family, isn't it? Some of you may have experienced that as a child, right? Where maybe your dad or your mom went through some really tough times when they were kids, or abusiveness or something like that, and they did not handle those wounds well, and you were impacted because of it. You faced the negative results of someone in your family not handling their wounds well, and now you have wounds that you look back on and you struggle with and you struggle to deal with. Now, here's the deal. It doesn't matter what your family situation is. Because if you have some wounds, and all of us have some wounds in life, regardless of your family situation, the way you handle that wound will impact other people. Even if there's nobody else living in the house with you, your wound and the way you handle it will impact people in your life, whether that's people at work. And so there's a variety of different types of wounds that we might have. Sometimes it's just somebody said something or repeatedly said something to us when we were younger, and boy, it left a wound. Or maybe there was a loss that you experienced somewhere along the way, and that leaves a deep wound that doesn't go away. Maybe it's betrayal. Maybe because some wound you can't trust. You ever known somebody like that? They just can't trust other people because of some wound that occurred a long time ago because of a betrayal. Maybe it's something like a long-term medical condition. Now, that's different than maybe something that somebody did to you early in your life, but a long-term medical condition or some sort of chronic illness or disease, that's a wound too, and it sticks with us. And so there's a long list of ways that life can hurt us and damage us And what I want you to hear this morning is the way we deal with that wound will impact our families. And so somehow we've got to figure out how to deal with those wounds in appropriate ways, in ways that doesn't damage our family. And to help us do that, I want us to turn back to the Old Testament. We're taking just a little break from our Old Testament series as we walk through the story of the Old Testament, but we're going to go back to an Old Testament story that we skipped just for sake of time, but I kind of had it in mind for this series all along, and that's the story of Jacob and Rachel and Leah. All right, so we're going to especially focus in on Rachel and Leah, who are two fairly famous people in Scripture. You may know their story, but let's kind of set this up. And the way I want to set this up is I want to start with where they ended, right? So you guys know the story at least a little bit. We'll come back and read it in a second. Rachel had things pretty good. She was the pretty one. She was loved. She was wanted by Jacob. But you get to the end of her story in Genesis 35, all right? So skip over. We're going to jump around in Genesis a little bit this morning. I'd love for you to turn there. Genesis 35. And we get the story of the death of Rachel. So we're going to the end of the story first. We're going to pick up in verse 16. Genesis 35, verse 16. Then they, this is the family of Jacob, journeyed from Bethel. When they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel went into labor, and she had hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, do not fear, for you have another son. And as her soul was departing, for she was dying. All right, so she is dying in childbirth. She called his name Benoni. Aren't you glad your mom didn't name you Benoni? Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem, and Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It's the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. You have to read the footnotes to know what the name she gave him meant. As Rachel, she had it set up for her pretty good. She's the pretty loved one. As she is dying, she names her son of my sorrow. Aren't you glad your mom didn't name you what she was feeling in childbirth, right? But she is dying, and in this process, she apparently has reached a point where she is bitter and angry, and she's bitter in this moment, and she curses her son. So again, you get to the end of the story, here's Rachel's story. Now this is kind of small on the screen, but we're going to kind of trace this down. She dies bitter, cursing her son in childbirth, and is basically buried in a roadside tomb. That's the end of Rachel's life. Now you get to the end of Leah's life in chapter 49. So skip over to chapter 49, and then we'll come back and kind of camp out in one place. So chapter 49, now remember, Leah didn't have things so well. She's kind of thrown into the middle of a big mess where her dad gives her to Jacob, and that's not the one he wanted. She is unloved. She is unwanted. She's in the middle of this family drama and tension. Talk about wounds. She's got some serious wounds. But watch how her death is described. Her death isn't described. Jacob just talks about it later on. This is Genesis 49. We're going to pick up in verse 29. Genesis 49, verse 29. Then he commanded them and said to them, this is Jacob talking to his sons, I am to be gathered to my people. So he says, I'm about to die. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. So he's just telling them where to bury him. Now listen to this, verse 31. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife, so his grandparents. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, my parents, Jacob would say. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites, and then it describes his death in the next verse. Isn't it ironic that Leah, the unloved and unwanted one, is buried in the cave with her husband and his ancestors, the fathers of the Jewish religion? Now, we don't get a whole lot of detail about this, about when it happens, but it appears that she dies as the wife of Jacob, the mother of his many sons, and is buried alongside Jacob, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah. It appears that she dies in a different place in life than Rachel, even though Rachel had things a whole lot better than her. Rachel dies bitter and angry. Rachel appears to die in a better place, maybe in a whole place of trust in God. Why the difference? You ever thought about that? Because usually Rachel is the hero of the story. Or Rachel's at least the one that we kind of look up to. We don't think a whole lot about Leah. But they seem to die in different places in life. Why is that? Well, let's go back to the beginning of the story. So I want you to go back to Genesis chapter 29. All right, and we're going to kind of hang out in Genesis 29 and 30 here. And so this is the story of Jacob and Leah and Rachel. And it's a bit of a mess. You want to talk about, we're going to read this because it's kind of important to set up everything we're doing this morning. You want to talk about some wounds. Read this story along with me and tell you if this stuff doesn't stick with you for the rest of your life. Like if you're in these shoes. So we're in Genesis 29. We're going to pick up in verse 16. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. So you got sisters. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. So we think eyes were weak is just a simple way of saying she was not as attractive as her sister Rachel. All right, so Rachel is the pretty one. We'll see in a second she's the loved one. Let's keep reading. Verse 18. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it's better that I should give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. I mean, this is like fairy tale stuff, right? He loves her so much he works 7 years so that he can have Rachel. Rachel, you can just read this passage and see she is beautiful, loved, and wanted. But here's where the drama comes in. And here's where the wounds start. Let's pick up in verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. I've served my 7 years. I'm ready to have Rachel as my wife. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place, and he made a feast. Throws a wedding feast, right? But in the evening, verse 23, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And so we don't know what's going on, but they go into the tent together, and apparently, again, Jacob, it's either dark or he's had some drink from the party. He doesn't know who he's with, right? And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Laban said, it is not so done in our country to give the younger daughter before the firstborn. So his excuse for his incredible deception is, we just don't do it this way. We don't marry off the youngest first. We got to marry off the oldest one first. That's why I've deceived you. Now again, imagine you're Leah in the middle of all of this. We don't know what role Leah had in this. We don't. Was she part of the conspiracy? But can you imagine the tension that she must feel in all of this? Verse 27. He says, complete the week of this one. So spend a week with Leah, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah and served Laban for another 7 years. So he gets a week with Leah, and then he says, okay, I'm going to give you Rachel, but you got to serve me for another 7 years. And the text is clear. Who does Jacob love deeply? Rachel. So you've got Rachel, beautiful, wanted, and loved. Leah, not as pretty, unloved, and unwanted. Do you think both of these sisters have some wounds by this point? Imagine this from Rachel's perspective. Her dad gave her sister to the man who worked 7 years. She's wounded. Leah's unloved. She's wounded. But watch what God sees. Isn't it the case that God tends to pay attention to the underdog? You see that throughout Scripture. And here it is again. Look at verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And so the Lord opens Leah's womb. On the other side, Rachel is unable to have children. And in this culture, this is devastating. Deeply, deeply devastating to not continue on your family line. So now you got all these wounds and tension. What a mess this is. And if you read the next few verses, Leah begins to have children. Her husband doesn't love her. All right, so Jacob is going to have children with several women here. So Jacob's just kind of enjoying himself in the background, right? But Leah is unwanted, unloved, and she starts having children. And the Bible actually tells us their names and tells us what these women say when their children are born, kind of like a blessing. And so she has 4 from the beginning. She has Reuben, and she names him Reuben because the name Reuben sounds like the Hebrew word for see. And she says, the Lord has looked on my affliction. The Lord has seen. She names her son with the basic statement, the Lord has seen me. And then she has another child, and she names him Simeon. And she names him that because it sounds like the word heard, and she says in the text, the Lord has heard that I am hated. Well, that's pretty cool, isn't it? She begins to name her children based on God's blessings on her. The Lord has seen me. The Lord has heard me. She keeps having kids. She names Levi based on the word that sounds like attached. She says, maybe because I've had a 3rd child, my husband will be attached to me. So is the wound still there? Is she still kind of struggling? Yeah, she's still struggling with all of this. But then 4th, she seems to come around and say, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to praise the Lord. She names her 4th son Judah, which sounds like the Hebrew word for praise. And in the text, she says, I will praise the Lord. So how is it that Leah sort of deals with her wound? It appears just by the way she names her kids that she trusts God through the wound. Isn't that fascinating? I don't know if I've ever really noticed this before. It's fascinating that Leah shows her trust in spite of the fact that she is unloved. She is trusting in God. Now, Rachel is jealous and she's bitter because she can't have children, even though she's got all kinds of stuff. So she decides, I'm going to give my servant to my husband. In fact, look at chapter 30. All right, so we're just a verse or 2 down. Chapter 30, verse 1. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. Right, so you can see the wound is leading her to envy, jealousy. She said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Jacob responds by saying, I'm not God. This is not my place to do it. And then verse 3, she says, here's my servant Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. Now we say, that's weird. In the ancient world, this was common for a servant girl to have children, and those children be considered just a part of the family, as one of, in this case, as Rachel's children, even though they were her servant's children. Just a part of the thing. Abraham and Sarah did it, right? So I'm not justifying, I'm just saying this is something that happens repeatedly, all right? So you get the picture. Look what she names her children through her servant, all right? You ready for this? First name is, God has judged me, and then says, and he's judged that I should have another child. So it's not necessarily negative, but then her second child, I have wrestled my sister and prevailed. The name Naphtali sounds like the Hebrew word for wrestled. And in the text it says, she says, I've named him this because I have wrestled my sister and prevailed. Wow, wonder if that stuck with Naphtali the rest of his life. She names her kid based on her tension and jealousy and infighting with her sister. Do you see a difference in the way that Rachel and Leah are naming their children? Do you see a path? One path that seems to be this path of bitterness and frustration and tension and anger, and rather on the other side, a path that seems a little bit more trustful in God. But it's not over. They're going to keep having kids. So basically, Leah decides to have children through her servant. And we don't know, again, that's confusing and kind of weird to us, but she names her children a little bit better. She names Gad. And she says in the text, good fortune is coming. And the word Gad, the name Gad, sounds like the Hebrew word for good fortune. And then I love this one. Asher sounds like the word happy. And she says in the text, happy am I. Boy, what a difference in the way that these two women deal with their wounds that perhaps leads to kind of the end of the story. Now you got to read this part of the tension in the story, because this one this one's hard to believe. Skip down to verse 14. So chapter 30, verse 14, and there's an incident between these two sisters. Chapter 30, verse 14. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. All right, so Reuben finds a special plant, brings them to his mom. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. And we're left saying, what in the world is going on here? We think, scholars think, and they're not certain at all. Here's what they think. They think that the mandrake was a plant that the ancient people believed increased fertility. All right, so basically Rachel is saying, if that plant can help me have kids, I need that. It must have been rare or expensive. So she says, I really want this plant. This is where it gets crazy. Verse 15, but she said to her, Leah says, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? See a wound coming back up again? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. So basically, Rachel sells a night with Jacob to Leah in exchange for a plant. I know, this is some strange stuff, but do you see how deep these wounds are and how this moment in itself indicates how much tension there is between them? So verse 16, when Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son that she named, God has given me, or sounds like wages, and she says, God has given me my wages. She called his name Issachar, and then she conceives again, has a son named Zebulun, which means my God will honor me, or the word sounds like the word honor, and she says, my husband maybe now will honor me. Wow. So that's Leah. But there's some good news in the story, because now you get to verse 22, and here's what it says, verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. Incredible. Like for a woman who has struggled with jealousy for all of these years, and now she finally has a son. Isn't this a beautiful moment for Rachel? Listen to what happens, verse 23. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. The word Joseph sounds like the Hebrew word, may the Lord add to me. In other words, Rachel finally has a child, and you know what she names her son? Give me another one. Talk about a bitter woman who had it all, right? She's got it all. And even when God finally blesses her, her bitterness still comes to the surface. Now, we could keep reading the story. We've read some of this. Eventually, she has another child, and she names him, and she dies in childbirth. She names him Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. So now, Rachel dies bitter, cursing her son in childbirth. Somehow, through all of this, Rachel never matures. In fact, her bitterness increased. She has some wounds along the way. What happened early on, even though she was loved by Jacob, man, that's some heavy stuff. But she eventually comes around and matures and honors God. No, it doesn't appear that's the case. And do you see the difference between her and Leah? Though Leah's wounds come up at times and she's not perfect, it appears that Leah deals with her wound by trusting in God and honoring him in some way. Just in the way that she names her children. Now, as you look at this story, who do you want to be like? I think sometimes we just kind of assume, well, Rachel's the hero of the story here. I don't think so. Because I don't think most of us want to get to the end and be bitter, angry, and jealous of the people around us. Somehow Leah gets to the end and she's in a better place. As you compare these two stories and think about the way that they deal with their wounds, here's what I would say. I'd just say this. We grow and mature when we trust God through the pain of our wounds. We grow and mature when we trust God through the pain of our wounds. Now, here's the deal. This does not take away the wound, and it doesn't take away the pain. And you guys know this because you've experienced this. You've experienced pain, you've experienced wound. But some of you, though, know that if you trust God through that, He's going to help you to grow and mature. And here's the crazy thing as you look at the story of Rachel and Leah, it doesn't matter if you're rich or smart or beautiful and popular and everyone likes you. Everybody has wounds. And everybody's got to learn to deal with those wounds because it turns out the pain of our wounds helps us to become like Jesus. The pain of our wounds helps us to become like Jesus if we're willing to submit to the process and trust God to help us to grow. And this is a New Testament concept. This isn't just some random comparison of Rachel and Leah. Here's how James says it from our scripture reading this morning. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete. The idea of perfection and completion there is maturity, lacking in nothing. James seems to say if we can learn to deal with our trials, with our wounds in such a way that honors God, if we trust God through it, He can help us to become more enduring, and He can bring about maturity in our lives. But this is hard, isn't it? I know I'm standing up here, and it's easy to walk out here and say, well, yeah, it's easy to say that. I know it's easy to stand up here and say, hey, this is what you just ought to do, right? No, this is a hard and painful process. But trust in God says, man, I don't understand it, but I'm trusting Him through it. And when we do that, He helps us to become more like Jesus because we believe what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. Don't misread this verse. This verse does not say all things are good. There are some bad things in our world. There are some people, all of us at some point, make sinful decisions. There are people who have made sinful decisions in your life that have wounded you, and you will carry that wound until the day that you die. We live in a world where because of sin, sickness and death prevail. And so you may have suffered the loss of someone that you love because we live in a fallen world. Not everything's good. You may be carrying around some sort of long-term disease or chronic illness because we live in a fallen world. It's not good. It's okay to say, what I'm experiencing is not good. But a deep trust in God says, even though this isn't good, I trust that God can work for good through my difficulty. And that takes a whole lot of faith and trust, and I know that it's hard. See, we grow and mature when we trust God through the pain of our wounds, and those wounds, the pain of those wounds, helps us to become more like Jesus. You know what we don't normally say? Pleasure makes me more like Jesus. I'm glad that we're part of a church where people travel and take cool trips, and people come back, and it's been fun hearing about some of your trips already this summer. You get to do cool things. But here's the thing. It's good to be able to do cool things, but nobody goes to Hawaii and comes back and says, boy, that helped me to become more like Jesus. Right? Pleasure, let's say it this way, a life of ease is not the pathway to growth and true joy. Nobody says, I got rich, and now that's helped me to be a better person. It's okay to be rich. It's okay to take a good trip. It's okay to enjoy the pleasures of life, but we have to acknowledge that while those are blessings from God, they don't usually help us to become stronger. No, difficulty, pain, the struggle helps us to become stronger, and if we're willing to choose to follow Jesus and trust Him, it helps us to be stronger and better. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of Samuel Morse before. So Samuel Morse in the early 1800s was a fairly successful painter. And in 1825, he was in Washington, D.C., and he was painting a picture, not a picture, whatever they call those things, painting yeah, you get it, the paintings they did back then of people, of Lafayette, for the fans of Hamilton. Lafayette, he was painting a picture of Lafayette. So he's painting Lafayette, and he gets a letter in the mail. And the letter says, your wife is very, very sick. So he's in D.C., he's got to get back to Massachusetts or Connecticut. And see, he gets back there as quickly as he can. When he gets there, his wife has already died. And it's been several days, and she's already been buried. He's missed it all. Talk about a wound that you carry for the rest of your life. But instead of allowing it to become bitter, though I'm sure he struggled, he was a man of faith. He decided that he was going to shift his interests from painting to communication. And over the next 15 years or so, working with other people, he developed the very first telegraph and the Morse code so that nobody else would have to experience what he experienced, so that instant communication would be more possible. He took pain, his wound, and he turned it into something good for other people. And so here's the deal. We have a choice to make, don't we? Our wounds, and the list would be very, very long of all the different wounds that we have. Our wounds can either make us bitter like it appears to happen with Rachel. It can make us bitter or better. And the choice is ours to make, isn't it? It's up to us to decide. Now I'm not minimizing the pain of this. We can go around the room. We've got a whole bunch of different types of wounds represented, and some of them are bigger and seem more unfair than others. Yeah, there's some heavy, heavy stuff here. But how we deal with them is up to us. As to whether they'll make us better or bitter, and by extension, how deeply they will impact our family. Because if you don't deal with your wounds in positive ways, if you deal with them in negative ways, it will impact the people around you. And obviously, it'll deeply impact you. Here's what's crazy about Leah. You come to the New Testament, and you know where you find her name? Unloved, unwanted Leah is found in Matthew chapter 1 as one of the ancestors of Jesus, because her fourth son, Judah, was in the bloodline of the Messiah. God brought about the Messiah through the bloodline of unloved, unwanted Leah. It appears that God honors those who trust him. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of Kenneth Jacuzzi before. Kenneth was 15 months old. Yeah, all this is I don't want to skip this. This is important. You know what all this basically is saying? All this is saying, I'm choosing to say that my story is for God's glory. And that's a choice, isn't it? Either we say, you know what, my story is my story and I'm mad about it, I'm going to be bitter and I'm just going to get this over with. Or we say, you know what, my story is not pleasant in times, but I'm choosing that my story will be a part of God's glory. It will point to God's glory, which is what Romans chapter 8 is all about, isn't it? We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And so, in other words, we believe that God will work for his glory and our good. But it's a choice to make, isn't it? That we choose my story and my wounds will be for his glory. My pain, as I've heard in a song recently, my pain is for his purposes. My mess is for his message. My story is for God's glory. Imagine the way it would change our lives from this point on if we decided, you know what? Whatever I've experienced, whatever pain I've experienced, I'm choosing to be better, not bitter, and I'm going to choose to make my story all about his glory. Imagine the positive impact that could have on the people around us. Now, Kenneth Jacuzzi, he's the little toddler in the picture. When Kenneth was 15 months old, he was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, which in the late 1940s it's a bad diagnosis no matter what, but it's a really bad diagnosis in the late 1940s. And the doctor prescribed hydrotherapy. And so his family had to make long, expensive trips back and forth to the hospital regularly so that little Kenneth could get his hydrotherapy. But his dad, Candido, decided, you know what, surely there's a better way here. And his family was known for making agricultural pumps. And so he studied the hydrotherapy pumps at the hospital, and he went home and he took the agricultural pumps and he worked on them, and he designed a portable water pump so that they could do their son's hydrotherapy at home. And it worked, and they started doing his hydrotherapy at home, and the medical staff was so impressed by it, they told Candido Jacuzzi, you got to start marketing this. And you know the rest of the story for Jacuzzi. Jacuzzi is a family name, specifically of a family that went through a really tough time, and they used their pain to make things better for a whole lot of people. But in particular, their son. They turned pain into an opportunity to help. They didn't get bitter. They worked on making things better. Here's the deal. Not everything you go through can be changed. There's a lot of wounds. There they are when he's a little bit older. A lot of our wounds can't be erased. They're ongoing. We've got a choice. Better or bitter. Imagine the impact that we could have on our families and the people around us, on the world for Jesus Christ. If we decided from here on out, my story is for God's glory. If we can help you to to know God's glory and begin a relationship with Him today, we would love to do that while together we stand and sing.
Some glad morning.